Hey there, this is Chris, and I think today we're going to dive into a really interesting story. I put a little poll on Twitter just trying to gauge interest, and there was a lot of positive responses. So I'm glad y'all are interested because I think this is um, the topic we're going to explore today is really interesting. Mainly the influence that state charts have had and the impact that they've had on what we think of today as traditionally client-side routing and even the blend of server-side client-side routing that's emerging from a lot of new tools and technologies. Um, so I'm really excited to dive into this. I've been doing a fair amount of research, and I feel like there's a really um, deep backstory that goes way back about 10 years ago. And just before we dive into anything too deeply, um, this the you know what I'll be talking about is happened way before I was even in web development. Um, so a lot of it is just me trying to find random pieces of information and sort of trying to piece together what happened. I'm sure there's much more knowledgeable people on this subject. So, but nonetheless, I think there's some really interesting history here. So yeah, let's dive into it. Um, for me, the story actually starts with this article right here. When I was doing my own research into routing about a year ago, I stumbled upon this. My research sort of stemmed from routing is sort of coupled to the view libraries right now. All right, there's a route and it maps directly to a URL. And what I was interested in is there are there alternative approaches, and that's like the way that's like just the way it happens now across all different types of libraries and frameworks and tools. I feel like, and what I was interested in is there a easier way to integrate routing with state charts and maybe orchestrate things easier and understand like what's actually happening. Um, and I ended up stumbling upon this article by Tomdale, who is one of the creators of EmberJS, sort of giving an overview of how they approached routing back in 2012. I won't go. I'm gonna come back to this in a little bit, but at least like a year ago, I wasn't able to like really find anything deeper on the topic for some reason. But in the past week, I've sort of stumbled back upon this topic again, and sort of gone down a rabbit hole, in that way. So it's taken almost a year to go full circle on this topic, but I think where the story starts is if we go all the way back to like 2009, 2010, there was an MVC framework called SproutCore that came out, and one of the things integrated into SproutCore, and that seemed like it became really popular, was this state chart library called Key, created by Michael Cohen. SproutCore came out of, from my understanding, is SproutCore came out of Apple, and Michael worked there. And it supported most things that you would suspect should be supported in state chart library: hierarchy, orthogonality, history, events, actions, etc. Sort of seemed like heavily inspired by David Harrell's original work. I couldn't find any explicit references to SEXML. At this time, SEXML was 4 years in. So yeah, it seemed like he sort of did his own thing in terms of the semantics of this particular library. And we could actually, if you go to Michael's blog, you could actually see there's actually some old posts about key, and so I just wanted to like quickly just show you what the API looked like. So if we go down here, this is a pretty good example. I'll zoom in a little bit. Basically, it was sort of like a JSON-esque API, but also very very like 2010 JavaScript API with like just like chain methods and stuff like that, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, you could define initial state, and then you could define each state and then events that state has on it. What's interesting is that so this is how transitions were defined. On mass down event, we have a function that's called, and you can define the state that you should go to. I want to. It's a small detail, but I think it's a really interesting topic because it could lead to non-deterministic state charts, because you can specify whatever state you want. That transition isn't necessarily static. So it's an interesting design decision, and I think it'll. I think it comes into play, that type of mindset comes into play as we dive deeper into like what Ember did. But yeah, there's. I think if we go up a little more, you could specify whether you want a concurrent state. So state A and state B are happening at the same time and stuff like that, which is really interesting. That brings me to a really interesting article about where state charts came into play. As I said earlier, SproutCore was an MVC framework, and what like Michael talks about in this particular article, which I think is really interesting, is can be visual. Is sort of talked about right here. The distinction between what at the time was called a mediating controller and a coordinating controller. And so the way that it's defined here is a mediating controller is responsible for mediating the exchange of data between the view and the model, while a coordinating controller is orchestrating the flow of data in the events in the application between the view and the model. And so what this article dives deeply into is the fact that state charts are a great coordinating controller. And so that sort of like gives us a graph, like a gist of like where they were used in MVC framework like SproutCore. So this is a really interesting article. And funny enough, we'll probably hopefully I'll get Fraser to come on again. We've both been researching into MVC and how to do the same thing with state charts. So it's actually really interesting to stumble upon prior art like this. So that's sort of where state charts came in the SproutCore, and the way a lot of these MVC frameworks were is because they tended to be pretty opinionated about, at least from my understanding, about data flow. It was actually pretty popular to use state charts in this type of context. So yeah, and obviously like you could perform actions as a result of transitions and stuff like that. But this brings us into EmberJS. So what happened is SproutCore 1 came out, Key was a part of that, and Eventually, Tomdale and Yehuda Katz decided that they wanted to come out with a new version, got involved in the project and wanted to come out with a new version of SproutCore v2. And I think eventually they decided for certain reasons to rebrand the project. So instead of being a v2, it sort of was rebranded into EmberJS. So you could sort of think of it more as like a hard fork of SproutCore. And so a lot of the work that Key did ended up in the initial versions of Ember. Oops. And yeah, there's an interesting Twitter thread about this at the time between Tom and Michael. I think now at the same time, it also seems like Ember definitely initially took their own twist to a lot of what SproutCore was, their own flavor of it. So one of the things that's interesting is like who first synced up the URL with the state chart controller. And there, if we dive a little deeper into this thread, you can actually see there's actually it's actually it's actually Key that was there is an initial API that would like sync up the URL with the router or whatever. But I think Ember took a more opinionated stance on how that should work, and I think these particular decisions of actually syncing up the router and syncing up the current state of the state chart with the URL is largely like what would branch into what we see as client-side routing today, and how it manifests in a bunch of those APIs. I think this particular statement that state charts couple hierarchy and behavior together, Ember decouples it, is really interesting because we'll dive into it. But what it seemed like is over times the concept of the state chart defining behavior was sort of removed in Ember in order to have other controllers or other entities control that type of behavior, whereas mainly this like really interesting connection between the way that Harel visualized hierarchy, a hierarchy of states, and how that really syncs up with how we think about routing, which is primarily hierarchical, persisted, and the concept of nested routers is a concept that that most routing frameworks today have. So what we're seeing here is sort of the start in probably around 2012 of hierarchical nested routing. And so that brings me back to this post where Tomdale sort of outlines like the URL is like one of the most important things of web apps, and our ability to take the state of an application, because that's really what Ember was doing at the time. They were a large advocate of like single page applications, where you're not using the server as much to coordinate, more complicated websites and web applications. And so once you start doing that, then you sort of lose the syncing between the state of the application and where you're currently navigated at in terms of a URL. And so he sort of talks about how Ember State Manager allows you to describe the states of your application in a hierarchical way, and then how they would serialize that state into the URL, so they were always in sync, which is extremely interesting. So we could actually see some API. So here's like an example that someone did all the way back in 2012 with the initial Ember router, or excuse me, the initial Ember State Manager. On a side note, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that Jacob Beard, who wrote Scion, which was a JavaScript state chart library, his master's thesis, he actually references Ember and Key as both inspiration for state chart libraries. So there might actually be some threads between a lot of Jacob's work and inspiration from some of these early state chart libraries at the time. But we could sort of see an example of some type of routing where the URLs involved, where our states sort of map to the URL, and there's orthogonal states and whatnot. And I'm sure we could dive into the code and see what that looks like. But there's actually some examples here. This was actually linked in Tomdale's article, this particular example. So we could sort of dive into it. So what you can see is we have a bunch of states, and we're sort of declaratively saying, hey, when we're in this state, we're tied to this URL. Now, what's interesting is you can nest these URLs together. So if we're in the post state and then post.index state, then we're going to go to /post. But if we're in the post state and then the show state, it's going to go to post/post ID. Right, and this actually feels very familiar to like the APIs that we have today with like React Router, Vue Router, Solid Router, whatever. So that's sort of an example of early on how they were trying to deal with how they were like thinking about routing and how they were using state charts almost as a way to organize routes, which I find really interesting. And there's a lot of good discussion here about how it works. I think one of the interesting things. So we remember how we were talking about how Tom sort of said state charts couple hierarchy and behavior. Ember decouples them. That's actually what I'm talking about. That's actually explicitly seen right here, where we're describing this hierarchy of states. And then, when we enter a state, we can set up a bunch of controllers that actually contain the behavior of that state, which is a little different than like how I typically think about state charts, where they are the behavior. There isn't some other entity that contains the behavior. And I think over time, that idea of decoupling the router from the behavior of the application or the controllers of the application, if you're doing MVC, it starts getting farther and farther away the more time goes on, which is really interesting. I'm not sure if it's mentioned here. But essentially, one of the things you'll probably notice is that again, there's no explicit transitions. It's all very implicit. So for example, when we enter this when we hit the slash route, right, we actually want to like redirect upon entry to post.index. And again, I think that sort of stems from Key's initial API. And it's funny that it manifests itself this way in Ember state charts, and and more in routing. And I think there's some deeper philosophical discussion about how routing works as the default for routing on the web, as opposed to the default for defining transitions with state charts. And there's some tension between that. I think that's really interesting. So for example, and I'm going to get to this later on, but the main thing is like at the time, Ember State Manager would just let you transition to any state from any other state. So it meshed well. It meshed really well with routing, where the default is you could go from one link to any other link, and there isn't necessarily a restriction. So yeah, sort of just trying to ground that. Now, as this post sort of lays out, what we were just looking at was Ember State Manager. Eventually, like V2 of Ember Router came out, and they sort of like started moving away from using Ember Manager. This is a little fuzzy for me, but my understanding is that Ember State Manager felt very verbose to use. And this new version of the router that they created was sort of like a DSL or more of a shorthand to define the same functionality. I think, and it seemed like what happened there is over time, we started explicitly moving away from this, thinking about this concept of hierarchical states that we could be in, and more just like, what's the route that we're in? And the fact that we could define this, a bunch of these routes in a hierarchical fashion, which is interesting to me. And so I think that's what this is sort of showing, this particular gist that I found, is that now we have an Ember router, and it can still be defined in like a hierarchical fashion, but it's not like the state manager that we had before that was like sort of explicitly a state chart. Some other notes about Ember State Manager is that it didn't support parallel states, and it didn't support history states. So like here's an issue of someone being like, hey, like, can we get parallel states working? For example, can we get parallel states in Ember, for example? And so again, I think this just highlights that further divergence from Hurrell's original formalism, and the fact that another like really philosophical question about routing is like the URL, the way it's designed is very hierarchical. It's pretty much a directory structure where you're trying to access resources. And what is orthogonality? What does being in parallel states really mean? And how is that represented in the URL? Is sort of a weird question. I think we'll talk about this more at the end. I think it's a really important question. And one of my previous videos dives into this about how important orthogonality can be in terms of routing. So yeah, again, deeper discussion, but again, the point I'm trying to make here is that over time, Ember State Manager and then what would become of Ember Router further and further diverged from the original state chart formalism. And there's some videos. So Tomdale talks about what they're doing with that here in 2013. Again, what they're bringing up at this exact point on this keynote is the same thing I was talking about before. Is there's this explosion of transitions that happens with routing, where you can we could represent our routes is hierarchical nested states, but there isn't like there isn't clear transitions from one state to another. It's sort of like any of them can exist at once until you get more of these, what they start talking about here, and what one of the same videos at the conference started talking about here, is how can we use state machines, and at least conceptually, to create flows, so login flows, checkout flows. In those cases, we obviously, routing is involved here, but there's a very clear path that we only want to we want to restrict the amount of paths that someone can go to. They can't just click on any link to go to any other part of the app. There's a flow, and there's an order to what needs to be done here. And once we get into these more app-like situations, as opposed to what the web historically is, which is just a URL defines a resource that you can load. That resource could be a blog post, it could be a home page, it could be a help page. But once we start defining these user flows, we want to actually start restricting the number of transitions that someone can take between the different states of our application. And that's where that first tension that I was talking about before really comes into play. Found another YouTube video about query parameters and how they were trying to deal with that. So this talk sort of talks about how instead of tying query parameters to the router, what would become Ember router, they would just bind query parameters right to the property of the controller. So you can see an example right here of that, where this array controller would just pick up the sort by query parameter, which is interesting, because I think there's a tension between, again, there's a tension between like what's the router doing, and sort of not the point of this video, but I think the scope and boundaries of what a router should be is so ambiguous. Routing is something that is crucial for the architecture of any web application or website, for any framework or tool, and it's something that sort of crosses all the layers. So view layer, behavior layer, the data layer, and it's really hard to define those boundaries right for routing. And I think that's another thing that we tend to see, and especially right now in at the current time, a lot of routers are almost becoming state managers. They're loading data, they're and etc. Defining navigation guards to define these flows that we want to define, to restrict routes, and so. That tension is real. So yeah, let's see. So that brings us to. So far, we talked about SproutCore, the statechart framework key, how that morphed into EmberJS, and how it manifested itself in EmberJS. And I think I want to move to the second part of the story, which is like, that was 10 years ago. That was 8 to 10 years ago. So I really want to dive into why I think what Key was exploring and what EmberJS explored, what's the impact and influence that it's had on routers from modern quote unquote frameworks, and I think it's less, at least nowadays, it's less manifested itself as explicit, like, oh, this router is actually a state chart, but more the conceptual model that state charts have brought to the table for how we organize this, the state space of our application, and the power that in this case hierarchy has. So this is a book called Ember in Action, and they sort of dive into a little more detail about like routing in Ember. That it's like chapter 3 I think, and I think these visuals are really important when we're trying to build an application. There is this intuitive sense that that the routing is hierarchical, and can be thought of as finite states. So we're looking at this picture here of these states that map directly to URLs in a hierarchical manner, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because I think the visual syntax that Harel chose for statechart, which is hierarchy is represented through containment, that this blog state contains two other states, post and post ID. I don't think it's a coincidence that maps really well to the hierarchical manner of routing of the URL, and how we think about routes and how we want to break down routes and define the controllers that map to those routes, that define the view components that map to those routes. I think that mental model largely is really powerful, is a really powerful way to combat the explosion of possible routes and how to break them down, and the verbosity of defining those routes. And sort of that mental model of how we're actually thinking about this. For example, here. And it comes back to the discussion we've already had, is I think the original state chart, for a lot of that, like there's been this divergence, right? There's no you could look at this image. There's no transitions defined for this particular example, and there's not necessarily orthogonality defined in examples like this. And I think that just has to do with the nature of routing on the web. And in most cases, that's how it is. But in other cases, we do want like an explicit set of transitions between these different routes to constrain. And so it's a matter of, do we very verbosely define all those possible transitions between every single possible route? Or do we restrict or guard from all possible to only these should be possible, right? So that there's like an inverse mindset between what state charts naturally want you to think about this problem versus how we typically think of routing. And I think that's where a lot of this divergence from the original formalism comes into play. And so the last part, I sort of just want to talk about the implications of a lot of Ember State Manager had on others. So for example, here's like a Google some conversation where someone's like, hey, like I saw that EmberJS like has a state chart feature for routing, like can we use this in Angular, right? And that sort of brings us into for example, a library that someone wrote called State Tree that pretty much took what Ember was doing. They sort of talk about it here that you can't use Ember State Manager outside of Ember, and takes that concept of like, let's define a tree of states that can then be used for routing, for example. And so, maybe this was used in AngularJS, for example. But what we do know is if we look at a bunch of modern routers, so React Router, Vue Router, Solids routing, Svelte routing, any of the meta frameworks like Next.js or Remix, they're all based on this concept of nested routes. And a large part of that influence comes from React Router because React Router is probably one of the most used routers in the world. Potentially, I don't know what the numbers are, but at least with like newer frameworks and libraries. But there are definitely some very explicit call outs from Ryan Florence, who was one of the creators of React Router and now Remix, thinking EmberJS for nested routes. In fact, React Router was first called React Nested Router, and sort of just saying, oh, we stole it from Ember before everybody else except Ember, for example. And then even Ryan, the creator of Solid, thinking Ember for nested routes. And saying how much of a game changer it was, and has used it since like 2012, and so I think what and you could sort of trace it back, right? So like React Router inspired Vue Router, to my understanding, and that's why like Vue Router has nested routes as well, and so I feel like you can like it, this last part is a little more loose. But at the same time, we can sort of trace it back and sort of see these links that Ember State Manager and Ember Router had on this conceptual mindset of decomposing a set of routes into a hierarchical manner that can be visualized or at least mentally thought about with a state chart. And I think that's very powerful. I think it really speaks to the visual formalism and the mental model that state charts help us think in and help us solve these types of problems in. And although it's that link is sort of invisible nowadays, I think it's still there, at least at a conceptual level, at least about like how a bunch of these new libraries make you think about routing and such. And I think it's really important. So that's sort of the story and partially my argument of the influence that state charts have had on client-side routing and the mix between them and whatever's manifesting now. I think there's a really tight history between these two, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we see hierarchical routing everywhere. And so yeah, that's sort of the story. And I think it brings up a bunch of different topics, mainly like the difference between applications and websites. Both of those words being loosely defined, right? And the at least at a conceptual level, like websites don't have a restriction between transitioning between different routes, while most applications usually do. It also comes in this topic of orthogonality, like why is it so hard to if you want a modal, to display a route right here. So currently we're on this tweet, and if we tweet the URL changes, right, that's orthogonality. I think it's an incredibly hard thing to do, and I don't think routers provide the primitives for them. And again, I talk about this more in one of my previous videos on routing. But it brings up that topic, and then it brings up this more important topic, which was sort of the takeaway I wanted everyone to have, which is which is why is hierarchy important in state charts? Why is orthogonality important in state charts? And sort of the cleverness that David Harrell had when he first created the formalism, they help us organize the state space of that we're dealing with. And I'll probably be having I'll definitely be having another video diving into this about why hierarchy and orthogonality are important. What is their role? And what are they helping us organize? Because I think it's another really important topic that this particular story highlights. So with that, have a great day and hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, I'm all ears. Just ping me on what's ever accessible to you. And if I did get any facts incredibly wrong, feel free to reach out and I will try to edit those out or at least amend my mistakes. So yeah, thanks for listening.